I really agree that without leadership, we'll all sort of be wandering around in aimless circles. But I have to tell you, I am so terribly encouraged by what I see of my children's generation, by most of you in this audience. You, unlike the generation before you, seem to have a much better appreciation of the international dynamics which impact on Australia and the impact of Australia's domestic policies internationally. I think at last we're starting to get that intelligence, that recognition. I would say that in the current crop of politicians that is still missing, unfortunately. And in fact, in the current crop of many of Australia's so-called leaders, I think that is still missing. I could list a whole number of issues. Science and technology, we still look inwards. In terms of international development in developing countries, we're getting better. But by God, it's taken a long time to get there. But I do see it in the current generation, in the current new generation coming through. I sometimes think, my God, what are their mothers giving them in their Weet-Bix? They're so smart and articulate, and they understand what's at stake for all of us. And I can only suggest and urge you to keep agitating, to make sure that politicians and other leaders just aren't politicians, leaders throughout the community start to understand that they are accountable for what we actually do in that policy setting, getting back to policy setting again. And that you can actually push forward to get a more intelligent, comprehensive approach.
Tim Costello.
Can I say there's a reason why young people are actually showing leadership? They have a longer-term future in terms of viewing this problem than the short-termism that's going through all other forms of leadership. So the wicked problem, I think, is pretty simple. In business circles, it's the short-termism. You are judged by quarterly results. So trade exposure being punished means, even though the business case is there, and I always find the argument about the business case a fascinating one, because if there's one thing the business is really good at, it's working out how to make a profit. So if the business case is always sound, business would all be there like that. The trouble is, the profit is long-term. The short-termism means it's very difficult. The short-termism is the political leadership problem. We won't see any effects from cuts we make now in maybe our lifestyle until 2020, and politicians are running in 2013. They're saying, that's not my problem, 2020. I'm not running then. The short-termism is in your parents' attitudes. People over 50 literally are going, but if we get a carbon tax and my energy bill goes up, I can't pay for Johnny's piano lessons today. But the long term says, well, Johnny and his kids may not have a future. And the great engine that does drive history, and we certainly see this in World Vision work, parents will make the most incredible sacrifices to their own detriment now, just so their kids can get a better future. At the moment, the short-termism of, I don't want my energy bills going up for those ballet or piano lessons is overwhelming the long term, which is why I think young people actually get it. You are the ones with a long-term future, and that's why the leadership is so strong there.
Just one thought on that. I think business spends its whole waking day trying to balance the short term with the long term across a whole range of issues. And sustainability, as a principle, is no different. There are some long-term costs, but there are some short-term benefits. And I think one of the problems is that business leaders think that in some way they should look at this in a different way to what they do every other part of their week. And it is fundamentally no different. There are some short-term costs, there are some short-term benefits as a long-term. It's an issue of balance, and what we've found over 16 years is that you can't get that right.
Yeah.
Now, I think we've got a question here, and if you can indicate for the microphone over here, and I can...
Thank you for raising the issue of climate change. There are two other issues, I think, which are impediments to economic development for the world's poor. I mean, Tim Costello had an article in the Canberra Times today saying that climate change would impact most heavily on the poor, and indeed we're
Calling
already
on the wealthy countries to
well, yes,
take their fair share.
yes, but you know, climate change is really going to impede economic development of the world's poor. Especially with regards to food security. I mean, we're seeing things like maize production in southern Africa is going to decline by 30% by 2020 or whatever, and there are real implications for food security. Now, the other two issues are...
So is it, just to get to a question...
So, well, I just would like someone to comment on this, and I mean, we're talking about business, but we've got real problems with food security coming up. One of the other thing that's impacting on food security is declining oil, which will follow peak oil, which is about now, and higher oil prices. And the other thing is still rapid population growth in particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So, you know, it's all very well to talk about business, but, you know, we have crises confronting us which are quite major and are really going to impact on the poor.
Okay. Harriet?
No, I'm glad you've raised that, and I don't know if you saw Oxfam International brought out a report just 2 weeks ago actually bringing those two issues together when they spoke about the problem of the looming food crisis and the fact that the poor increasingly don't have enough to eat, and the combination with climate change, and the really pretty noxious combination that gives. And I think there's a number of answers, and one of them is critical, is the way in which we seek to tackle the food crisis. Because actually, the world, as Gandhi said many years ago, the world has enough food for everyone's need, not enough for everyone's greed. And so it's critical that the way we ensure there's more food is by working with those poorest farmers of all, the smallholders, so that they themselves are actually growing more but are actually then in control of that as well. And so putting smallholders right at the heart of any strategies to tackle the food crisis is fundamental, and it's one of the recommendations that Oxfam makes. And that includes doing it in a more sustainable agricultural way that is less dependent on oil and fertilizers, which the first sort of green revolution was very dependent on water and fertilizers, two commodities that are increasingly in short supply. And so it's finding more sustainable ways that are absolutely in tune with each different country and each different locality, as we were talking about before. Also critical to that is absolutely climate change, and certainly in our experience working with the fair trade farmers, nearly every single farmer is experiencing the effects of climate change already. This is not a future problem, they're feeling it now with natural disasters, but actually more with the complete haphazard nature of the seasons nowadays. And so one coffee group, for example, in Uganda has seen a 40% fall in production because it never rains when it used to, so you plant and it doesn't rain, and then suddenly the rain comes just when you're about to harvest, and it's really destroying their livelihoods. And it was one coffee farmer from Tanzania was actually at a meeting like this in Britain once, actually, and he was asked, someone in the audience said, well, I'm really worried about climate change, and what's the carbon footprint of your coffee? Which increasingly, nearly every producer group we talk to is being asked that by their buyers, by the big buyers based over in countries like Australia, are asking these farmers, what's your carbon footprint? And these guys' brows shot up, he's a really polite guy, and he said, my goodness, I wish you could come to my village. In my village, we haven't got one fridge, not one DVD, not one television. My farmers don't have one bike, let alone a car, let alone 2 cars. They haven't even been to the local town to sell their coffee, let alone hopped on and off planes all their lives. Don't tell my farmers to clean up the mess that you lot have created.